Another positive thing about a Cleveland oil system is, other than a Windsor or 302, is over here on the side of the block. So the oil pump, we can go to a bare block. The oil pump is right here. It goes through the oil pump, pumps it into the filter, filters the oil, puts it back into the block. This oil plug right here is used for your pressurized sensor for a Windsor or 302. That is where you pick up your oil pump pressure. So really what you're measuring right here is you're measuring how much pump or how much pressure you have before you have any losses of oil going through the engine. So you're really kind of measuring what the pump is really putting out at its best case scenario. The good part about the Cleveland is our oil pressure gauge is back here. So what happens here is the oil pump again pumps the oil into the engine, fills everything up, fills all your lifters on this side, fills the main bearings, fills the cam bearings, and whatever leakages you have between the oil pump and all those things is measured all the way back here. So you're measuring oil pressure at its worst case scenario. So this is really what you want to measure back here, because now you have measured the pressure after your main bearings and everything have already been fed. On a Windsor style block, you're measuring your pressure before anything has been fed. Now, we had a engine, matter of fact, come in not long ago that had 80 pounds of oil pressure out here on the filter. But every main bearing, every rod bearing, and every cam bearing in the engine was burned up because the engine didn't have any oil pressure. It had pressure out here, but the engine didn't have any oil pressure. And because there was a flow stoppage in the mechanism that put oil into the engine. So just because you have oil pressure on your gauge in your car doesn't mean you have oil pressure inside of the engine unless you know where it's being fed from. So on our blocks, we still maintain this as a place to be able to keep your oil pressure fed. And we also add another one over here on the side, which is actually the main oil galley. On a Titus block, this is common between the lifter galley and the main galley. This is the crossover. So you can measure it either which way, but we usually, for a clean look, I use them over here on the side because that way you don't have your oil pressure transducer or anything back here on the back of the engine, and also it makes it easier for the manifold to go on and off. So now we've looked at how the lifters actually restrict oil, because these have to restrict oil. If not, you have a big oil leak between the oil pump and the main bearings, and that is your lifters in a Cleveland. So understanding how this works, this edge orifice system works, is critical in understanding how you have to restrict or how you want to direct the oil flow in the engine. And a lot of folks never, in a lot of the discussions I would say that I read, this is never mentioned, never taken into account of how the system actually works. They just kind of go into generalities of you're going to do this, you're going to do that, this works, that works, but they never get down into the nitty-gritty of why this actually works. And this is your separation right here from the bottom end of the engine to the top end of the engine, which I'm going to skip all the way down to the next thing, to the last thing, is another thing that I hear mentioned so many times: pump the pan dry. You're not going to pump the pan dry, period. End of discussion. If you pump the pan dry, you have another issue other than any of this stuff going on here. Because in order to pump the pan dry, that means the oil pan physically has to have no oil in it. And if there's no oil in the oil pan, that means it has to be somewhere up here, because it can't hide anywhere else. The engine is a closed system. So that means you have 5 quarts of oil sitting in the top of your engine and no oil sitting in the bottom of your engine, because your oil pan pickup should be within 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch off the bottom of the pan. So that means you probably have 5% of the oil in the oil pan compared to the 100% that you actually put in it. Now, pumping the pan dry is a possibility that someone might see due to a lack of pressure back here at the oil pump or the oil pump pickup. where we pick up the pressure reading. So if you see zero pressure back here or you see lack of pressure, it's because you have a big leak going on inside of here. It's not because there's no oil in the oil pan. Because if there was no oil in the oil pan and all the oil was sitting inside the valve covers, it would actually be puking out the valve cover breathers onto your headers because they won't hold 5 quarts. The only other place it can live is here. These have drains. Drains right down into the bottom cavity of the engine. So that gets me to high volume pumps, low volume pumps. And that's usually where we see, or I should say standard volume pumps. That's where we see a lot of that discussion go on. And usually someone on the internet asks, I'm building an engine, should I put in a high volume oil pump or should I put in a standard volume oil pump? And usually about 10 people will jump on the guy right from the get-go. You're going to pump the pan dry if you use a high volume oil pump. Or you're going to kill your distributor gear. Maybe those things have happened to some people, but that's not generally what's going to happen to 99% of the people. And I'll usually kind of sometimes maybe horn in on the subject a little bit, and I'll ask a question, and I'm trying to make people think. I'm not trying to tell you what to do, but I'm trying to make you think. Again, volume of oil times what restriction you're trying to put it in determines what kind of volume you have making pressure. So my thoughts are this on high volume versus standard volume oil pumps. And they are, since an oil pump is a positive displacement pump, so it's sort of like, it's not a vane style pump where you can have slippage. A positive displacement oil pump that pumps a liquid medium is basically a hydraulic pump, like what you would use on a log splitter, a backhoe, or anything like that. It's pumping pressure or pumping fluid at a certain volume per revolution. Again, volume determines, against your restriction, determines the amount of oil flow that goes through the engine. So, when you have an oil pump that has a certain size gear in it, it pumps a certain volume of fluid every time it turns around. Now, if you would keep restricting that down and down and down and down, what happens? The pressure goes up. Now, the pressure will go up until the relief spring in the oil pump opens up. And the relief spring in the oil pump is to keep you from blowing the engine apart, because it would physically, or could, if it didn't blow the filter off first, you could physically split a block with an oil pump. Because there's that much, it will create that much pressure, or it would probably wring the distributor shaft in half. But there's a relief valve. And where the relief goes is back to the inlet side of the pump. So the pump, any oil that it doesn't want to send to the engine, and these pumps usually have a relief valve that's set at about 86 pounds. They're really consistent at about 86 pounds. Now you can put an aftermarket spring in there, it'll make about 95 pounds. But a standard pump off the shelf will usually do about 86 pounds on the spring in the standard with the spring in the standard location. This pump is going to make about 86 pounds max, period. Doesn't matter if you have a standard volume, a low volume, whatever. The relief valve is what controls the oil pressure, the maximum oil pressure, not the pump size. The relief valve does. So where this does is when you start up your engine cold and the oil is thick and everything is hot, the reason that the oil pressure is not 300 pounds is because the relief valve is actually relieving this and recirculating whatever oil that it cannot push through the engine, is pushing it back into the oil pump to reuse it again. So instead of sucking oil from the screen, it's actually just recirculating the oil inside of the pump. So that gets to when people say if you're going to use a high volume oil pump, you're going to pump your pan dry. Okay, this is the reasoning that I use behind that. If this will make 86 pounds, whether it's standard volume or high volume, the only thing that it's going to do, the only foul that I'm going to have by having a higher volume pump is my oil pressure, pardon me, is going to maintain 86 pounds. Whatever's going to circulate is going to circulate in here. It's not even going into the engine to be able to pump up to the top. It's staying inside of the oil pump. So if it stays inside of the oil pump, how is it pumping the pan dry? It's not. It can't. The other thing is, what controls the amount of pressure going into the engine from going other than this relief valve, is the volume of oil that it pushes through my oil clearances. So then the argument becomes, well, if I spin this thing a whole bunch of RPM, it's going to pump out a whole lot more volume, and that is 100% true. But the volume of oil that it can push through the engine is primarily fixed, because as you rev the engine up, your oil clearances don't go from 2 3/4 thousandths of an inch to 27 thousandths of an inch. They still are 2.5 or 2.7 thousandths of an inch. So your oil, the orifice never changes, but the volume definitely does change because you're pumping the oil faster. So if I turn this oil pump 2,000 RPM or I turn it 4,000 RPM, it theoretically should pump twice the amount of gallons per minute. But what I'm putting through the engine does not change. Your main bearing clearances, rod bearing clearances, cam bearing clearances do not change as you rev the engine up. If they do, again, you need a whole nother different video. So with that, what we design our stuff around is, what is the engine going to turn in RPM? Where is the engine going to stay in RPM? Now, if I build an engine that's going to say turn 7,000 RPM, it's going to be a street engine, but this guy is going to use, it's a street strip car, and he's going to spend a lot of street time on it, and he's got an overdrive transmission. This thing's going to spend 1,900 RPM for hours and hours and hours going down the street. I'm putting a high volume oil pump in it. And the reason being is because the engine's only turning 1,900 RPM, and it still needs all that oil flow. Now, if this engine is going to be, say, a dirt track engine or a drag race engine, to where pretty much it's going to idle from the pit to wherever it starts to race, and that's about the only low RPM it's ever going to see. And typically those engines don't idle at 800 RPM either, like a street car does, or 900 or 1,000. They usually idle at about 16 to 1,700 RPM or greater. But the engine is going to see most of its life, say from 4,500 to 8,500 RPM. I'm not going to put a high volume oil pump in there, because we're going to be, the life of the engine, where it's going to be used 90% of the time, is the volume of the oil is going to be great because the oil pump is spinning so fast. But if I'm sending a car down the street, again, with, it's going to turn 2,000 RPM, it's going to spend the majority of its life in the 2,000 RPM range. That's why I want the extra assurance of more volume with a high volume oil pump. Now, the other thing that we see is, well, if you put a high volume oil pump in there, you're going to tear your distributor gear up sooner. 86 pounds of pressure is 86 pounds of pressure. It doesn't matter if it's making it with a pump that's this big, or if it makes it with a pump that's half this big. It's still the same amount of strain on the distributor gear. Now, if you put that 95-pound spring in there, or you want to be one of those guys that bigger is better, and you put, shim this guy up and it's making 125 pounds of oil pressure, now that's a different story. But 86 pounds out of a stock spring is 86 pounds out of a stock spring. It doesn't matter how big the oil pump is. I can stack 10 oil pumps here. It's still going to be 86 pounds. Nothing is going to go out of this pump that the engine's not going to accept. The engine's bearing clearances stay the same throughout the RPM of the engine. Now, what does change is the viscosity of the oil. So as the oil does get hot in a street engine, again, because you're circulating it over and over and over, we would like to see two things. Either one, an oil cooler, or a bigger pan, preferably the oil cooler. But we would put a greater volume pump in there, so that as this pump spins slow with thinner oil going through those same clearances, we do have enough volume to maintain a proper pressure in the engine while it's being used under those circumstances.